Now in Health Watch, as coronavirus concerns grow on the Diamond Princess cruise ship in Japan, the U.S. has evacuated all remaining healthy Americans. 2 State Department chartered flights arrived in the U.S. this morning, one in California and the other in Texas. CBS News foreign correspondent Debora Patta is in Yokohama, Japan, where some Americans are still quarantined on that cruise ship. So, Deborah, give me a sense. How are people feeling?
Well, I have to say they're pretty frustrated that they couldn't get on that plane. The situation on board the Diamond Princess has been deteriorating as infections continue to soar. And while the U.S. has evacuated most of its citizens, some chose to remain put. That's probably because they still have family being treated at hospitals in Tokyo.
For the over 40 Americans left behind in hospitals in Japan, last night's evacuation was tough to bear.
It was kind of devastating not to be able to join them.
Rebecca Frazier from Oregon has been in hospital for nearly 2 weeks with the virus, but has had none of its symptoms. Her husband, who tested negative, is waiting for her on the Diamond Princess. They are worried that they might have to undergo further quarantine in the U.S.
It's a strain mentally, emotionally. We have lives to get back home, and I get that they need to make sure that we're clear. But once we're clear, we need to go home.
Faratu Tunchian and her 71-year-old husband Mohammed are from LA. They were reunited in hospital over the weekend after she tested positive for the virus 6 days after he had been removed from the Diamond Princess with the illness.
I'm doing better than him. He's still fighting the virus, and the virus is a nasty one, as everybody knows. He has fever.
More than 300 Americans were met by U.S. officials wearing hazmat suits who escorted them off the Diamond Princess onto buses that ferried them to Tokyo's Haneda Airport, a process that took hours to complete.
Well, we're exhausted, but we're on the plane, and that's a good feeling. Pretty miserable wearing these masks, though.
In Wuhan, China, the crisis epicenter, another 1,200 military doctors and nurses have arrived to help contain the virus. That's good news for Megan Monroe, a trainee teacher from California who chose to stay in Wuhan, where she's been confined to her apartment.
I decided that I would be safer locked into my apartment than being on a plane with 200 people.
It must just be so tough for those people who are stuck on that ship. Some Americans who have made it back to the States, they're not quite in the clear either. So give me a sense, Deborah, will evacuated Americans have to essentially restart their quarantine duration now that they've landed back in the U.S.?
Yes, they will, Tom. I mean, it's pretty rough for them. Imagine they were on this luxury cruise. They thought they were going to tour scenic Asia. Instead, they've been seen medical staff in hazmat suits for 11 days on board the cruise ship. Now they've flown back to the U.S., and although they've touched down on U.S. soil, they will have to undergo quarantine for 14 days to ensure that that virus hasn't flared up. And we already know that some members on board that flight did have the virus. They found out just before they got onto that plane. And then there are those that have been left behind. There are those on the ship. Some have family in Tokyo who are being treated for the virus. Others chose to stay. They were given the option, and they were told that if they stayed, they might not be allowed to return to the U.S. until early March. Then those who are sick are in hospitals around Tokyo, and for them it's also a pretty rough time because they can't speak the language. It's been a time when they've had little communication with the outside world, isolated into rooms. So I think that all round this is a pretty hard time for the Americans and the others who've had to stay in quarantine.
Yeah, it seems incredibly stressful, but I want to broaden the scope here because it's not just Americans who were on this cruise ship. It was an international kind of group that was on this cruise ship. So are other countries planning evacuations for its citizens off that ship?
You're quite right. There was nearly 4,000 people on board that ship. It was a massive luxury cruise liner and many, many nationalities on board. We do understand that Hong Kong, which neighbors China, obviously, and borders sort of the worst of the epidemic, the epicenter of it in Wuhan, they are looking at bringing their nationals back. There's a couple of hundred on board that ship. And we're also hearing that Canada might do the same and South Korea. So certainly there is an effort. We've also heard from some British passengers. They're frustrated that their government is not doing more to bring them home. They're saying other nations are taking huge strides to evacuate people off that ship, and people are worried that the longer they stay there, there could be more infections, and the chances of perhaps getting infected continue to rise. So for those countries that are evacuating, there are huge sighs of relief from the passengers.
What a tricky situation with the stakes pretty high. Deborah, thank you very much.